From making a Venom movie without Spider-Man to giving Morbius his own movie, Sony's attempts to compete with the Marvel Cinematic Universe have been weak. And on paper, making a Madam Web movie makes as much sense as either of those films, but MCU fans shouldn't underestimate its potential to disrupt their preferred franchise. At the moment, the cast of Madam Web is almost entirely under wraps. We know that Dakota Johnson is playing the Madam herself, and we know some of the other cast of the movie, but those actors are all playing roles that are a mystery to us. Earlier this month, though, superhero movie insider Jeff Snyder may have just revealed Sweeney's role. According to Snyder, Sweeney is playing Julia Carpenter. And to explain why this is big news, I should begin by explaining who Julia Carpenter is. See, she's a pretty important character in the Spider-Verse of the comics. Julia was created by Jim Shooter and Mike Zeck, and her first appearance was in the 6th issue of the 80s Secret Wars event. Oh yeah, she was introduced in a story called Secret Wars. Coincidence? I think not. Anywho, Julia received her spider powers courtesy of the Commission, a government conspiracy. After Secret Wars, she joined the mainline Marvel Universe and became the second Spider-Woman alongside Jessica Drew. She eventually took on a nickname of her own, going by Arachne and donning a black and silver suit. She became more important to the Marvel Universe after the Gauntlet storyline. There, the old Madam Web is killed and she transfers her powers to Julia, making her the new Madam Web. As Madam Web, Julia Carpenter is a powerful clairvoyant who can see the threads that make up the web of life and destiny, also known as the Great Web. It's essentially a map of the universe that some characters can travel along. In exchange for being able to see the Great Web, though, she loses her eyesight. That's where she's at in the comics. What does her introduction mean for Sony's Spider-Man universe? Quite a lot, actually. So far, the SSU has been made up entirely of movies based on villains. While Sony was able to use Venom's straddling of the line between hero and villain effectively, the same didn't work for Morbius. Most of the other movies in the upcoming SSU slate are also based on classic Spider-Man villains. I think it's safe to assume that Sony will skip Jessica Drew and the Arachne identity to make Julia Carpenter the one and only Spider-Woman. At least all these villains will have a heroic character to go up against. That's gonna be pretty important since the post-credits scene of Morbius suggested that the MCU Vulture was setting up the Sinister Six. Having a Spider-Woman-centric franchise is certainly a clever way to avoid the thorny situation around Spider-Man, because Marvel Studios can totally print money with Spider-Man movies, and Sony gets a massive cut of the take. They'd avoid disturbing that setup if they can help it. So, rather than get into some legal quagmire over sharing Tom Holland or introducing a different version of Spider-Man, they might go for a different approach. The fact that Julia Carpenter could be the first big-screen Spider-Woman in history is also gonna be huge news. It'll generate tons of hype. All that being said though, I don't think Sony is giving up on Spider-Man just yet. So let's consider her impact on the MCU. For starters, it's worth mentioning that introducing Spider-Woman in the SSU will keep her out of the reach of the MCU. I'll start with the inverse impact of her Julia, and this movie as a whole on the MCU. Just by the nature of Madam Web's character, you can imagine that this is going to be a very multiversal story. But it's worth asking why Sony would want to do a multiverse movie at this point. They've had a lot of success with the Spider-Verse animated movies, but those don't justify turning the SSU into a multiverse. No, the only way that can make sense is if they intend to further tie the SSU to the MCU. I'm not sure if Marvel Studios could stop them from implying that the MCU and SSU exist in the multiverse, but I am positive that Sony Sony is gonna try. Doing this would open the door for multiversal hijinks between the universes. Could Tom Holland and Sydney Sweeney team up at some point? Will Julia Carpenter get to face off against the MCU versions of iconic Spider-Man villains? Okay, they're all dead, so never mind. But this would open the door for Tom to face off against his fellow Tom's version of Venom, not to mention the Sinister Six. Now, I've been implying that Sony is doing this to Marvel against their wishes, but it is possible that Marvel Studios wants this to happen. We all know that the current multiverse saga of the MCU is going to end with Avengers: Secret Wars. In classic MCU fashion, that movie will adapt elements from both comic versions of the Secret Wars while also bringing its own twists to the story. According to leaks from people like Jeff Schneider, Secret Wars is gonna honor the entire legacy of Marvel movies before the MCU. To that end, it's gonna feature tons of cameos from past versions of characters they have in their movies. These rumors include reappearances from Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield as their respective Spider-Men. In a way, Marvel Studios have already established that the Raimi-verse and the Amazing Universe exist in the same multiverse, but they might appreciate Sony reestablishing those connections in their Madam Web movie. Also, they might want to pitch Julia Carpenter for their Secret Wars, since she has a connection to that story. Notice that Madam Web is set to hit theaters on the 16th of February next year. Meanwhile, Secret Wars was slated to come out in May 2026, and it's looking unlikely that it'll hit that date. I don't think that timing is a coincidence. So that's what I think Sony is planning here. But we haven't addressed the real question yet. Will this work out for Sony? After all, they were probably convinced that making a franchise out of Spider-Man's villains would work, and they were wrong about that. I don't think that this Madam Web movie has the potential to turn things around, though. Making a Spider-Woman franchise instead of a Spider-Man one is a bold move, but it's bold in a way that makes sense. If they can back this strategy up with good writing and direction, I honestly think that Sony can forget about Spider-Man. I don't think they will, but they could. And this is where Marvel Studios should be the most worried about Julia Carpenter being in this movie. See, the reason why Disney was able to talk Sony into this strange arrangement in the first place was because they needed each other. Disney needed Spider-Man, and after failing to capitalize on the IP effectively, Sony needed Disney's help to turn Spider-Man into something people would watch. But if Sony can find their own success with this IP, they might be emboldened to grab their toys and go home. Perhaps Julia Carpenter is just a stepping stone for the SSU to become successful enough that they no longer need the MCU. Once they're in a strong enough position, they'll yank Spider-Man back and sideline Julia in favor of introducing Tom Holland or whoever to their universe. The next couple of years are gonna be really interesting in this dance between Marvel and Sony. But that's all I have for you today in my reading of why Sydney Sweeney's Madam Web might be bad for the MCU.